Hello, everybody. We are live here, and boy, do we have a treat for you. Um, if radical centrism is your thing, we like to specialize in kind of, radical centrism, which is the cream of the crop. We don't talk about Democrats and Republicans and Joe Biden centrism. What we got here for you today is Jayant Bhandari, and I hope I'm saying that correctly. And Conrad Hamilton. Yeah, all right. And Conrad Hamilton. Jayant Bhandari is the owner or part of Anarcho-Capitalist Inc. And various investment firms, libertarian thinker. Conrad is a doctoral student at Paris 8, famously, the alma mater professor of, Deleuze and Foucault. So this is going to be a very interesting talk. Both are, supporters of Chinese regime, or at least are interested in the development, if I think it's fair to say, which is in terms of challenging the Western narrative of China as kind of this, oh, here we have a general kind of bad guy state, and the United States is going to treat them, like sort of like a Saddam Hussein. And this is kind of a challenge to that Western narrative. So why don't we start very briefly? We got in touch with Jayant because somebody shared an article about his comparison of China to India and the belief that India will not surpass China in the near future. And I said, I know this guy. I was like, wait a second. So I said, oh, I wonder if he'd be willing to talk with us about it. And he's here with us today. So Jayant, why don't you tell us, or what are your thoughts on the differences between India and China, both ancient civilizations, both kind of humongous populations, around 1 billion people, and what is the difference between China and India? Why is China going to kind of surpass India in the global market, or just as in success as a nation? Why, you would think these two relatively, advanced nations, with talented people in them, would both be successful. Why do you think China has some sort of edge over India?
Thanks for having me, guys. See, the big difference is that culture matters. And Chinese culture is extremely different from the culture of India. India is inherently a chaotic, feral culture. Indians, as a society, don't really have anchors of morality or rationality. If you have ever been to India, nothing works in India. Everything is absolutely chaotic. I tell my Western friends about the traffic in India, and they are usually in disbelief when I tell them about what happens in India. But the fact is that the moment the gate of your plane opens, you face a complete chaos. And this goes on until the time you depart from India. Until 1980s, early 1980s, India was a richer country on per capita basis than China was. Something started happening in the 80s in China, and you can see how per capita GDP started to drift upwards as when China is concerned. India continues to stagnate, and India has continued to stagnate. Now, of course, India has grown over the last 30 years, so you will see 100% or 200% growth in GDP per capita of India, but China has grown humongously over the last 30 years. The thing is that Chinese have a culture of discipline. Chinese have a culture of commitment. They have a culture of work ethic. None of those things exist in India. And, you can go on into the details of why India does not have those things. But the fact remains that over a period of 300 years, Christian missionaries tried to infuse the culture of work ethic, not being superstitious, to have integrity in the Indian society. And Christian missionaries were successful only to a very minor degree. And those are the kind of Indians you meet outside India. They left the country. Uh, Now, what I have seen over the last 30 years is, and I've been going to China for the last 15 years, and I go to China quite a bit. I spend a fair bit of my time in China. What I see is that China is increasingly becoming disciplined. China, sometimes when I'm in China, I have to pinch myself and tell myself I'm not in the West really, because China looks so developed compared to India is. China continues to improve. When I started going to China, people used to spit on the street. There was no concept of lineup queues. Now, increasingly, I see concept of lineup and queues. When I started going to China, there were no bookshops in China. Now, India, at the same time, is getting worse and has got much worse over the last 30 years. It has become increasingly chaotic. Institutions that the British left in India have increasingly fallen apart. People are becoming more and more feral because institutions no longer function in that country. Lineups don't exist in India. If at all, things are getting worse. People are becoming more criminally minded, which is the exact opposite of what is happening in China. So, at the superficial level, at the underpinning levels, at the secondary and tertiary level, everything I see in China is on a positive path. Everything I see in India is on a negative path. Hence, India is going to underperform, and actually, India will get worse and worse with time. Whereas at least China has a hope to continue to improve, despite the fact that at one point of time, China will will need some changes because it has been growing continuously for the last 30 years, and a time does come when you have to make a drastic change in the society, or it does happen automatically.
Yeah, so Conrad, I'm sure you have some things in response to that. I wonder how much of your political framework, which is a libertarian framework, is influenced by seeing kind of maybe the failures of the Indian left. And what do you think of the Chinese left and the Chinese Communist Party specifically in their relation to this improvement in China? Do you believe that it has anything to do with the Leninist model that China has?
Well, firstly, China is not a Leninist country. And so we can go into a discussion on that thing. China is not a Marxist Leninist country in any way whatsoever. China is the most capitalist country I have known in my life. It is more capitalist than the West is today. Now, about the failure of the left in India, there's no left in India. The Indian institutions are so feral that there is no anchoring to any system of thought. I often say to my Indian friends that leftism would be an improvement on what India is today, because India it's just a feral, wild country with no social cohesion or political vision or social vision. So there's no left in India. The left in China was very different. It was a communist socialist country until the late 1980s, or at least late 1970s. And China has made a complete about turn from there. It's an extremely capitalist country. You go to a Chinese store in China, and I have been to smaller places in China. The response of people usually is, I have what you want, now tell me what you want. That's how entrepreneurial and capitalistic and Chinese are. At the same time, when I go to a store in India, he looks at me as a problem. He says, why are you here? Get out of this place. Don't trouble my solitude. So that's the difference. China are entrepreneurial. They are money minded. They want to generate wealth. They want to educate their children, and they actually even fight for human rights. Increasingly, I see people is standing up to authority. So China has actually made a massive change from what it was in 1780s to what it is now today.
So Conrad, your mic is not working. Your mic is cut out.
I just want to commit
There
on
you
that.
go.
So I'm a little bit. I mean, you know, I have some questions about this sort of general cultural genealogy you're laying out, particularly when you use terms like inherent. But I mean, I was interested when you said that China is a very, very capitalist country, and I feel like there's a risk there that two things, which are somewhat different, are actually being conflated. So I think it's clear that, you know, in a lot of parts of China, starting with really the special economic zones, right? I think the first were Shenzhen and Zhuhai, right? And later, you know, a lot of those same policies were introduced to other areas, especially on the Pacific coast. You know, often it's described, right, by Western media as a sort of Wild West in terms of the fact there's very little business regulation, right? You know, and you have economies that are very, very heavily mobilized toward the production of capital, right? Now, at the same time, right, if we look at a lot of, we just look at basic statistics about China. I mean, you know, of the 124 Chinese companies and the Fortune 500, 92 are public, right? I mean, you've got all kinds of sectors. I mean, aviation, tobacco, sports, you know, oil. I mean, really most of the major industries except tech in China are publicly owned, right? You know, about 40% of the GDP of China is public, and I think I was particularly shocked to read that in China there are 3 times as many public sector productive assets as private sector assets, whereas in the West there's actually 50% in the US or UK. And you know, the state, you know, they make what they do. I think part of the strategy here is that the state makes enormous capital investments, right, in order to, you know, further the development of infrastructure and so forth, and to build the things, right, that actually aid with the accumulation of capital, right. So I read in 2009, I think it was 2009, China invested 49% of its public budget in public capital assets, right? I think at that time, you know, and probably still is, the highest anyone has ever invested in history in you know, of a public budget and capital assets. So when you say China is very capitalist, I mean, I'm just saying, how can you, what kind of criteria are we using to define that?
So,
you know?
So Conrad, I have been investing in China for the last 15 years as well. And that's one of the reasons why I keep going to China. Now, you're completely right that public sector is massive in China. The public sector company, there are many public sector companies, and they are huge. Public sector banks, public sector infrastructure companies, all kinds of public sector companies, mining companies. But look around your room. Look at your mic, look at your laptop, look at the lamps behind you. All are made in China, and they are made by the private sector in China. Mm-hmm. As time has gone by, in the 1980s, 100% of China was public sector. Now, I don't know, I have not verified these numbers, but I use your number. You said 40% of the GDP comes from the public sector. So that is how much the public sector has been diluted away in China. Now, if you look at many of the public sector companies, and I look at the financial accounts of a lot of these public sector companies, the return on capital, return on investment is minimal. And those are not the companies you and I will come across in our day-to-day life. Tobacco is an interesting thing. The government is heavily involved in tobacco because it generates revenue for the government. Chinese are smokers, and it generates a huge amount of revenue for the government. So yes, public sector is huge, but its importance is getting less and less as time goes by, and most of the growth actually comes from the private sector. Now, you talked about infrastructure. The reality is that around the world, we haven't really figured out a private way to generate infrastructure. China, of course, is involved in producing, in constructing infrastructure, and China has done an exceptional job of putting infrastructure together. China has moved from virtually no existence in railways, roads, electricity network to a system where China today has the largest rail roadwork in the world. It has the largest railway network in the world. It has the largest high-speed railways in the world. Now, and I was there in late 2019, just before it started, things started closing down. You can now take a train from Shenzhen to Hong Kong in 20 minutes. That's good. That's how good the trains are in China today. The train stations are like airports, classy airports. That's how good the infrastructure they have built. So yes, China has invested a lot of infrastructure, some of that has probably gone down the drain, but they have done an extremely good job of putting their infrastructure together.
So, okay, I really want to highlight, the private sector has not really figured out a way to develop infrastructure the way China has. And kind of along with your, you yourself don't put a big emphasis on public dissents, and by big emphasis, by that I mean, I guess, to un-neoliberal it. Give me a second. I'm in work mode a little bit. Let me un-neoliberal that. Public dissent you don't see it as a good thing necessarily at all. So I'm wondering, what is it about socialism itself that you don't like? Why are you libertarian anarcho-capitalist when it seems like you value all these things which are social kind of general regulation, the allowing of speech to a certain extent, but not criticizing kind of the main the president or central committee and kind of order? Where does, I don't see where libertarianism comes in your viewpoint. I see you valuing China or valuing East Asia in general, but a lot of it is yeah. What's your problem with socialism?
Sorry, can I jump in there? Can I jump in there as well and add a question to Eliot's?
Okay,
I think,
go for it.
I just want to add quickly. So I think that's an interesting question. So we're kind of talking about certain tensions in the viewpoint being advanced. I mean, it's interesting to me because on one hand you said, well, if you look at the countries that are really, if you look at the companies that are really profitable in terms of investment, that are growing, they're coming from the private sector. At the same time, you're talking about infrastructure. I mean, I think.
That goes to the same question, which is, in terms of socialism, seems to provide a backbone to all these things which you appreciate.
I just want to say, if you're gonna invest, if you're gonna build a very expensive rail transit line, for example, right, you can sink a lot of money into that, right, and the gains will be realized incrementally over a long period of time. So that's not necessarily something that would be so attractive for private sector investment. So it seems to me when you talk about these things, which China has really excelled in, they're examples of the successes that are being had by public sector companies, even if they wouldn't be attractive necessarily to private investors, let's say. So that's what I wanted to add.
Right. So
okay, Conrad, take it away, Jayant.
So indeed, China has done a fabulous job of putting a good infrastructure together. But as I said, even the most otherwise known as capitalist countries also have governments doing the infrastructure. We haven't really worked out nicely how to involve private sector in putting the infrastructure together. So the fact is that is the way the world works today. We haven't really improved on that. But most of my freedom, most of my quality of life in China does not come from what government does. It comes from what the private sector does. I can go to a private bank later in the evening on Sunday and I will find it open. Some banks are open, I think, up to even after 8 p.m. in the evening, even on a Sunday. So those private sector banks provide me quality of life. Those private sector companies provide me a quality of life. Now, roads and infrastructure is historically government built around the world. So there's nothing exceptional about China, except that they have done a good job. But remember, Chinese have a good work ethic. They have a good a way to plan things and implement on this. This does not change my opinion about socialism, and this is not socialism
Jayant,
anyway.
With the COVID crisis, and you've referenced the hospital that was built in 10 days, that seems to me like something that could not be done in a liberal democracy. And you've referenced kind of the failure of the West to do such a thing, and the failure specifically of, Americans, contemporary Americans versus kind of maybe past Americans that were more industry modernist minded. So yeah, once again, it seems like there is a role of socialism, but is that also something besides socialism?
Yeah, it's we are thinking about different things here. So America could have done something very similar 70 years back. America built massive infrastructure. Germany built massive infrastructure before the Second World War. America fought in the Second World War, and it built planes overnight. America was capable of doing it. What we have done in the West is that we have hollowed out our institutions. What has happened, and that is actually that's because of increasing socialism in the West. Increasing socialism is a result of increasing democracy. And we can again talk about another very controversial thing. I dislike democracy because democracy has a tendency to make a society feral. The Western society has increasingly become feral because institutions have been hollowed out, and that is the result. We can no longer implement the big infrastructure projects that China can today.
Okay, so we have to go back into history a little bit to discuss this, because we're going back. Obviously, as automation progressed and industrialization progressed, there were acute economic difficulties, that both preceded and followed World War I. It's often said that, were it not for World War I itself, that Europe would have very likely went socialist, right? So I think that one thing is that, if you look at the way war was used, and there's a lot of parallels between, the New Deal come war economy, or what was going on in Italy with Mussolini, or Nazi Germany with Hitler. I think in a way, war was used to sort of, stimulate effective demand, to use sort of Keynesian terms, rather than going sort of the socialist direction. But it's interesting, right? Because if you go back and read Lenin, and actually thank you to Ben Burgess for sharing this detail with me. But if you go back and you read Lenin, one thing he says is that, we have to look at what the war economies have been doing and learn from that, right? So I think in a way, the question of actually existing socialism, maybe its historical limit, is in a sense, how do we create a war economy without necessarily actually having war, right? Because at some point people realized if you just kind of built all these things, right, then that would be. So I guess so you're here. I'm trying to understand. You're saying that that this ability to engage in this kind of infrastructure spending has been lost. I think and then you criticize democracy, but it's funny, like in the United States, right? You've got most people supporting public Medicare, right? But Joe Biden will not support it, right? Donald Trump said he was going to do something about it. He's not doing something about it. So in a way, don't you think that democracy could be, in China, I think the public often supports an expansion of the role of the state. Don't you think that
Conrad, are you saying that history is the history of class struggle? Is that what you're trying to say?
I'm saying, don't you think in a way that democracy is conducive toward these large scale spending measures that potentially equalize, have the consequence of partially equalizing the distribution of wealth?
So there's this misconception about China just because it is run by a party which has a word communist in its name. It's the most capitalist system I have come across in the world, and I have been to close to 100 countries in the world repeatedly. Now, China, from what I know, has no real concept of social welfare. If you don't work, what happens? You go hungry. If you don't have money and if you are sick, hey, your problem. So those who think China is a socialist welfare economy is completely wrong. China is not.
Mhm.
So I think we really have to understand that about the so-called socialism of China. Those things don't exist. And in my view, that's actually the right thing to do. Because if you don't work, hey, go hungry. I have been hungry many times in my life. Go hungry, have some honor and pride in you, not to beg for free money from other people through the government as the wolf. Now, coming to democracy, the problem with democracy is that most people in the world, even in the most enlightened society, have no interest in philosophy. So, unlike you, Conrad, most people have no interest in philosophy. They don't have an interest in ideas. What happens with most people is that they are interested in their weekends. They want to go back home and have their beers, and they look forward to their vacations. And that is the reality of the most enlightened countries, the majority in most enlightened countries. As a result, in a democracy, that is the sector that prevails. And that is what's happening increasingly in the West as the culture gets dominated by, with every cycle of democracy, as culture imposes its populism and its bread and circuses expectations on the politicians. That's what's happening in the West increasingly. Now, you talk about Joe Biden not offering free health to people. The reality is you can't. There isn't money for it. If you offer free healthcare, there just simply isn't money for it. Joe Biden has overpromised, and there is simply no way you can implement that. Once you come to the seat, you realize that the only thing you can do is to print money. And after a while, if you keep printing money, hyperinflation kicks in, which is actually going to happen into the US anyway.
Okay, I got a lot to say. I got three things, and I don't know, Eliot, maybe I can say those three, and if you want to add something, you can. But
I have things, but let's go. Let's do the proper Marxist versus capitalist and less Western socialist interjection, which is a little less formal, which is more me. So go for it, Conrad.
Well, I do. I'm enjoying this discussion because I think we share certain similarities in our views that are just codified very different ideologically. But the first thing I want to say about, you talked about China not being a welfare state. It doesn't have, obviously it's a poorer country than many countries in the West. It doesn't have equivalent systems. My understanding is that, in urban developed areas, the quality of public insurance is reasonable. But in the rural areas, for example, it's terrible. And there's nothing like a national healthcare system. That having been said, again, it kind of goes to, I think, what you're talking about when you say capitalist, right? Because it seems to me that you're talking about, one, a lack of regulation, and two, a lack of social welfare. There's an article by an economist who's a China specialist named Barry Noten, and he says, is China capitalist or socialist? And he uses 4 axioms, right? One is, government ownership of the economy, extensive government ownership of the economy. 2 is ability of government to dictate economic outcomes. 3 is social welfare, and 4 is democratization. And he concludes that the first 2 elements are very present in China. They own a huge share of the economy. They're very involved in the direction of the economy, but they aren't strong on social welfare and democracy. And I do think, and you've already alluded to this, that those things are connected. By the way, I just think it's funny because you talked about you should have to work to eat. Lenin said the same thing, of course, when he set up the Soviet Union. He said, this isn't an open buffet. You have to work if you want to eat. So
that theme has certainly been lost in contemporary socialism.
Well, the contemporary socialism,
if you listen to the old even the unionist songs, IWWs, it's for those who toil, right? Those who work.
Yeah, that's sort of a workerist conception. The second thing I just want to say, when you talk about when you say, oh, well, because you've said before, like in India, people aren't educated. Actually, I know some people in our audience, probably think, oh, this is just elitist. Derrida has a book called Voyou. And Derrida, of course, was Pied Noir, Sephardic Jewish, French, and grew up in Algiers, when it was still French. And he talks about how in the 90s in Algeria, they had an election, and the party that was leading in the election was actually anti-democratic. They wanted to end democracy. So the government canceled the election to save democracy, right? So I do think, there's something to be said for this view. But again, I think this is a question of development. I mean, it seems to me that there are parts of the world that were so sort of damaged by colonialism that there has to be a kind of construction of education and civil society, right, that would favor the extension of democracy rather than it necessarily being the conditions being right there from the get-go. The third thing,
especially talking about India, in terms of, I think there's a conception, especially for right wing, that England was good for India. They brought kind of Western civilization to India to some extent, and then they left and things went wrong. We don't really know how India would have developed without British colonization. We don't know what would have happened in terms of, so to kind of add to your point, Conrad.
Well, and let me just get to a third thing. I just want to say about Medicare. I don't understand what you're saying when you say the money is not there. I mean, Canada pays a third or half of what the States pays, per capita. So whether, it's always got to be paid for, right? The question is, how are we paying for it? And obviously there are a lot of advantages associated with, the public system in terms of streamlined delivery, in terms of being able to order drugs and so forth en masse. I think economic figures have consistently shown the public delivery of Medicare is for most purposes, more efficient. So those would be my 3 comments here.
Well, so let me quickly state about Canada. I'm a Canadian citizen. I lived in Canada for many years. And I tell you, if you have a simple problem in Canada, it can take months before you can get to see a doctor. A lot of Canadians actually fly to America to get treated because in many places, private healthcare is not legal. So Canadian healthcare does not necessarily work the way people think it works. And in fact, a lot of Canadians are very proud of the Canadian healthcare system. And the reason is they don't know any better. Now, I'm currently in America and I've been to hospitals here. It's much, much easier to get to a hospital and to see a doctor in the US and get good treatment very quickly here. So there's a massive difference between Canada and the US when it comes to healthcare. The second thing is that Canada actually spends a lot of money on healthcare. I don't know the number off my head. They do charge you an insurance money every year, which is comes to around $700-800 per person, and government then gives a lot of money for the healthcare, which means that the taxes are higher in Canada, and as a result, overall GDP per capita is much lower in Canada because government controls a much bigger sector of the economy than the US does. Now, coming to India, what you said was that we would not have known what India would have been like had England never arrived in India. Actually, it is very clear what India would have been like if European powers haven't come to India. And in fact, we know what the Middle East, what Africa, what Americas, and what the Southeast Asia would have been like had European powers never gone to those countries. They would still be cavemen kind of people. They would still pretty much have a very feral lifestyle. Africans did not have a proper written language before Europeans arrived. They did not have any technology. Farming was very basic, and it was European colonizers who, Africans did not know what copper was. It was Europeans who decided that you had to take earth out and process that into generating metals. So, we know the history of humanity of the last 250,000 years, and that would have continued in the third world countries had the European colonizers never arrived there, which is that those people would have continued to live a life of tribal people, of extreme poverty and subsistence existence.
I got two things. Eliot, did you want to ask anything or add anything?
No, I mean, what comes to mind is the way modernity came to the rest of the world. Modernity came to England too, the UK, in the form of the Romans, right? UK was a tribal society. It was, warring society. And Rome, modernity came to the UK, then it got beaten back, then it came again, and it didn't get beaten back. And then it slowly integrated into the global market. How once the UK is kind of colonizing things within this framework of modernity, you're not going with Caesar, you're not building hills, there aren't people running at each other, you're going with, just really overpowered weaponry, and you're just kind of like enslaving the local population, or really just bending them to your will. And I think it would be a mistake to simply ignore, you could say, the main line of Western political discourse, right? And I think, when you're Marxist, when libertarian, a lot of what you're doing is you're challenging the main lines. But I think one of the things that's worth keeping in mind is that colonialism does have these resounding effects, both for China, in terms of how you see your national state, how you see your people, what you think you need to keep out of your country versus what can you let into your country. You still see that in China with the various skirmishes and then things that are imposed by the British in terms of how the internet is treated, how culture is treated, in terms of maintaining an insular culture. I think that's a result of colonialism. It's easy to poo-poo it because I think we get tired of other discourses kind of taking precedence over, the colonialism discourse, one, becoming vulgar, which is what happens in regular, and it turns into this kind of, vaguely liberal race theory of plurality and whiteness, and colonialism strangely gets missed in these discourses usually, and you get this kind of weird, woke capital kind of thing, which I think everybody is a little bit sick of. But colonialism itself is, I think, in terms of when does a place get colonized, when does a place get integrated into the global market, which UK wasn't part of it. It was China. And then it was the Arab bloc in India, and then it was Rome, to a certain extent.
Could I? And I just want to say two things quick. Sorry, I didn't mean to double team you too much.
No, but yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I just kind of want to interject that there is a way to take in the colonialism without kind of going into these kind of you could say the vulgarization of colonialism into reactive activist mentality. Like, there is a material effect of colonialism on how power gets distributed. Well,
let's talk about what
it's used for.
So I think 2 points I have. One, when you talk about healthcare, you made this comparison of Canada and the United States. I mean, when you talk about people traveling to the United States, obviously those are people who have money, right, to pay there. So I think, in America, right, if you don't have health insurance, a substantial number of people don't have health insurance, you can get saddled with, I don't live there, but I understand, like $100,000, $50,000, $20,000, right, for going to the hospital. I think the point is this. When people go to assess the actual, when you look at the quality of American healthcare versus Canadian healthcare, I don't know. Maybe we can say it's the same. In Canada, it's equalized. In America, it's better if you're rich and worse if you're poor, right? But I think what's important to distill is in Canada, it's a lot cheaper, right? When you talk about costs, again, whether it's private, whether it's public, it's got to be paid for. So when you say, well, in Canada, it makes up a significant share of the budget, that's true. But per capita, people are paying more in the United States. It's just being paid through the private sector, right? And that, of course, creates all kinds of middlemen, right? All kinds of things that on the level of efficiency, I don't think we need for that delivery. As regards, your take on sort of colonialism and development. I mean, Marx, I don't know if you know, Marx writes about India. And he it's a bit controversial because he says that, the British have sort of created the conditions of modernization in India that will have to be seized upon eventually, right? And he talks about the railroads that were constructed in the English language and this kind of thing. And we know without the English language, there's no India, right? Because that's what holds all these very diverse groups together. But I just want to differentiate, to just kind of clarify here. I think you're kind of, when you say these places would have remained in this state, I think, maybe you're underestimating people's ability to self-initiate the process of modernization, right? And actually, if we look at the self-initiation of the process of modernization, often that was really favored by certain forms of isolation, right? If we look at Japan, right, they're like, no Europeans here, we're going to modernize ourselves, right? With the Meijis, right, late 19th century. If you look at China, right, China, of course, was not, it was very negatively affected, but it was not pervasively colonized by the West. The West wanted to cut it up into different pieces. Because it was not directly colonized, that was never accomplished, though again, they would try later. And once China, achieved its kind of communist revolution, the first thing it did was it kind of shut itself off to focus on, building civic unity, building heavy industry, right? Building infrastructure, maybe some misguided initiatives as well. But, often we talk about the Chinese miracle, starting with Deng. Important to remember is that period of closure had growth rates of like often 6.5%. Right, which isn't, at that time was, I think, the highest in history, right, before the Chinese miracle. So again, is it possible, I just want to ask with respect to your narrative, is it possible that these places that, if they were shut off, that many of them may have recognized the impending threat of colonialism if they had more time and space to do that, and reacted in a way that allowed them to modernize?
As somebody who's an empath and whose chakras are aligned with the crystals around my apartment, I can sense that Jayant is upset a little bit by the possibility of self-starting modernity. I'm just kidding. I don't have any.
Actually, Eliot, you are in a way correct. It's there is no evidence at all, absolutely none, that Africa, the Middle East, or the Indian subcontinent would have started the process of modernity in any way whatsoever. There is, in fact, every evidence that since the time European colonizers left those countries have actually been falling apart. So United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank give you completely wrong information. All those third world countries are actually imploding as we speak. Maybe in a few years' time, when we talk again, India will probably have fallen apart. Africa is in a massive crisis. There's nothing works in Africa. However, it's politically incorrect in the West, so the media will not openly talk about it. A genocide is going to happen in South Africa at some point of time. But again, it's so politically incorrect that the media won't talk about it.
So I think there's a point, which is you're correct that it seems that infrastructure sometimes falls apart when the colonizing country leaves. And I think then you have to ask, what is the reason for that? When that does happen, a lot of times it's like, oh, there's a character of the people, there's a sort of essential quality of the people. And I'm not sure that's totally the case. In terms of what is the ideology of the country, how did the ideology respond to right?
There is no ideology in Africa and in the Indian subcontinent, and to a large extent in Latin America. They are materialistic people, and they want to get everything now, and they want to consume everything today, and they are selfish. They are inward-looking individuals who want to amorally acquire as much as they can. They don't really have a concept of morality in these societies. It was the Christian missionaries and European colonizers who influenced a section of these people to understand the concept of moral values. There wasn't any of those things there. Now, Eliot, you mentioned the concept, the fact that these people were enslaved. Now, if you actually go and talk to a normal guy in Africa or a normal guy in India, he did not really know what enslavement was. He actually had a lot of respect for Europeans. Even today, British are hugely respected in many third world countries.
Sure, but
They
I
were
mean, there was
not.
enslavement historically in terms of, you look at Belgium or countries like that.
Yeah, but listen, they were not as brutal as the leftist intellectuals of European and the Western countries today make it out to be. The local people like America, they like United Kingdom. It is only over the last 20 years or so when the international media has been telling those local people that if you complain about America, you will get more free stuff. So some of the intellectuals in the third world countries have started complaining about the Western countries. But the normal guy loves America. The normal guy loves going to McDonald's. The normal guy loves consuming Western
But
products.
people
He has
love
respect for the
McDonald's.
West.
Conrad, thoughts?
I want to. So I think
Sorry.
I think it's very typical. I think it's very typical. You know, when you know, you have these sort of hierarchies, right? Whether they be colonial hierarchies or class hierarchies or whatever, that people oscillate between resenting, you know, people who are in greater positions of power than themselves or have more privilege than themselves, and sort of being fascinated by them. And I think part of that owes to the fact that, you know, historically, the ones who've had, you know, the ability to generate the most sort of robust propaganda for their social class or their nationality or whatever have been the ones at the top, right? So I think that that's very significant. But as regards what you're saying about the degeneration of, you know, countries after colonialism, I mean, you know, I think most statistics throughout the world would suggest that have been disseminated. You claim there was some deception. Most statistics would suggest that, for what it's worth, that we've seen a tendency of the wealth between the West and the rest to achieve a greater level of equilibrium, you know, each decade sort of after colonialism transpired. But there are some bona fide states which are not successful. Now, I don't want to sit here and say that, you know, that's all because of the West. You know, there are different causes. But I think we do have to look at, you know, the role of, you know, international institutions, you know, in generating conditions which are unfavorable to those people. I already said that, you know, in Africa, we have 50% of manufacturing capital that's foreign owned, right? You know, it seems to me that if you look at a lot of the success of China, which we're coming back to, it's that, you know, they had this communist structure, you know, and then with Deng, they opened up. The problem is the communist structure had only got them heavy industry. They couldn't solve the problem of service or light industry, right? So with Deng, they kind of opened up, and you know, Samir Amin talks about the Dengist openings being not so different than what transpired in India, but occurring in a very different framework, historical framework. They opened up and they were using Western capital, right, for investment, you know, renting out their cheap labor, but not letting Western capitalists take full control of their country, right? So that they'd be in this position where they were paying rents, right, like an African country. You know, this goes back when you know, when France was at war with Algeria, right? You know, Algeria was fighting for independence. The French Communist Party controversially said, you know, look, we shouldn't end colonialism. We should try to make Algerians full citizens and develop, you know, that part of France. I think this is very haplessly idealistic, but this was their idea. Because if Algeria becomes an independent country, they argued, you know, the West is just going to exploit it relentlessly and it'll rob it of a lot of the potential success it could have, right? So, you know, again, when you talk about this degeneration and seeing China as successful, how indissociable is that from, you know, an exploitation that's being affected by the West?
So whatever you said, Conrad, is a projection of your views on the people in the third world. What you said is what you would think if you were a third world resident. That's not how the third world people think. People in Africa, people in Indian subcontinent don't worry about hierarchies. They don't worry about their fascination or hatred for hierarchical structures. They are amoral, irrational people. They accept their existence the way it is. So they don't really have those intellectual, ideological opinions about their state in the world. They accept their fate as it comes. So unfortunately,
yeah. Jayant, can I just interject quickly? As a fan of psychological thrillers from India, I see what you're saying in terms of there's an Indian kind of cultural ideology, which is you do what you need to do in order to get what you want, and that's it. But I think you're selling India a little bit short in terms of there is a kind of long historical culture in India. There is a written language. There is society, and a lot of the the ideology is different than the West in terms of the West has the kind of universal principle, and you apply the universal principle, and what do you think of the universal principle? But not to get too crystal ball, but there's an idea of kind of karmic return in India, which I do like, which is you will end up pursuing your interest, your egoistic interest, but society does. I think there is still a notion of societal return regarding that to some extent. Do you disagree that there is a kind of like there, because India's been culturally solvent in a lot of ways in a kind of larger society than Europe has, a lot of Europe. So I'm a fan of India personally.
Yeah, and as a white guy, as a guy watching India through the television screen, or going to India on a 5-star vacation, India will look very good to you. The reality of India is very different, and I'm not selling India short. I want that country to improve. I actually developed 2 companies in India, and one became a market leader in India, and it became so big that it actually acquired the British company whose subsidiary I started. So the fact is that I don't want to sell India short, except that India is far worse than I can explain it to be. The reason is that even I look at India from my chauffeur-driven air-conditioned car. India is a horrible place. It's a hellhole. And my poor friends tell me that India is far worse than I can even imagine or explain. And unfortunately, that's going to be the case because I'm not going to live in a sewage and experience the true India. So India is a horrible country. It's imploding. It's falling apart. Now, you talk about the ancient culture of India. This is a made-up thing by politically correct people in the West because they want to look that we are all equal. The Western people
Hinduism is real. Hinduism is a
of course it's a real. Of course it's
right.
But there's hardly any moral values that the society gets from that religion. It's a pagan religion of celebration. It's a religion of afterlife. You want to keep bribing the god to get a better life in your next life. There isn't a concept of doing good to the society or doing good to the humanity. That's not the main part of Hinduism. Now, Buddhism actually emerged as an offshoot to bring moral structure to Hinduism. But even that failed because the culture basically dominated on that new religion as well. And that's what's happened with Christianity and other religions as well. Christianity in India today is voodoo religion. If you Google Christianity, voodoo, India or something, you will see some strange, outrageous videos of what happens in some of the Christian churches in India. So the problem is the culture of those societies, and there's no evidence that India had any superior kind of culture in the past. It's a lot of made up stuff. And the reality is that a lot of good things, the Vedas, many of the historical temples that now are well known about India, they were actually discovered by the British. British discovered the texts and translated those texts. So I don't want to sell the West short, because the West has given Indians the possibility of becoming human beings. It wasn't a humane existence for India, and it still isn't human existence for maybe 99% of Indians even today.
Well, it sounds like they gave India, if this is the case, if Britain came in and they sort of found and translated these older texts, not unlike Egypt to a certain extent, where a certain Egypt was lost and semi-rediscovered, then it kind of sounds like India has been given history, and of course, who's going to look good in that history? I mean, England's going to look pretty good. In terms of the hellhole, so let's say this is the case where a lot of poor parts of India that is lacking kind of infrastructure, like you're saying, open sewage, things like that. But isn't it the ideology of nationalism, which I've heard you talk, you're not a fan of, especially Indian nationalism specifically? Isn't that the problem? Like, in terms of this, there's instead of kind of concrete infrastructure and things being put into place that would raise the quality of life, it gets, nationalism becomes, and I would say a lot of right-wing ideology in general becomes a Nietzschean or a centralist or a vitalist kind of a pursuit of power. You have power, you use it for yourself and things like that. And wouldn't kind of a solid leftist, like China or otherwise, that focused on infrastructure, that focused on improving the quality of lives for the Indian people, be a good thing? Because I'm not under a delusion that I would be able to go to India and function in a place very well, and I'm used to like my apartment with air conditioning in a place that has kind of less infrastructural comforts. I'm not under that delusion, I think. But part of me thinks the solution is not necessarily purely essentialist doom, which is, it's very cool to read. I read lots of libertarian essentialist doom literature. It's very fun. That's not Conrad's view. All views are my own. But I think that there is a possibility with the right administrative kind of ideology if it could take power. And there is a large, of course, Indian Maoist, these larger groups, although they're not anywhere close to taking power, but there is a kind of socialist communist ideology within India, although it sounds like for you they're more of a joke. But hypothetically, if there was a shift on infrastructure, a leftist shift on infrastructure, would that not be a good thing?
Can I just jump in there? I wanted to, is that okay, everyone? Yeah. I wanted to just say, and really in relation to Eliot's point, I just wanted to say that, well, first of all, we got kind of a weird thing, because I sort of talked about the West's role in, neocolonialism owning capital, and you responded and you said, well, most Indians, aren't concerned with those things. But then you also earlier said that most Indians, are so uneducated they can't understand the world. So it's like, I'm not sure how that works at the level of.
So Conrad, let's let Jayant answer.
No, let me just get one more point. But okay. as regards
the triad is a unique Hydra beast. So
as regards what Eliot was saying, I just want to say about infrastructure. So I actually see what you're saying, and I know, I think, when you talk, there's so many things that are really interesting here. It is true, right, that a lot of like this romanticization of India has either been created by a fairly elite sort of Brahmin caste, offering their sort of sanitized and revised version of Indian history, or has been generated, by or in conjunction with the West. So I do take that point. I think when it comes to, when you talk about because I feel like when you talk about morality, you're really talking about the morality of civil society, right? Not like a really particularist kind of morality, but what a society, kind of a somewhat secular morality, what we can do as a society to advance, right? And there's a strong concept of universalism in Christianity. But when the British came to India, of course, that wasn't, that couldn't extend to all people, right? Because of the basic stratification that was necessary to the maintenance of colonialism. If you look at China and the socialist revolution they had, modernity came to China through communism, right? That was the way that it sort of came to China. So again, just kind of trying to get your thoughts on this whole issue here, Jan.
So Eliot talked about bringing a new management to India to somehow put that back on the path to a stable society. There's only one thing that I can imagine doing to India to get it back on a stable path, and that would be to bring the British back to India to run it. India does not have
that seems unlikely.
Right.
Yeah, go on.
And not only that, that has to be the British who ruled India in 1940s. The current British cannot manage their own country, so we are past that stage. And that is why I said repeatedly earlier that India is on a path to implosion. It will implode. Pakistan is 20 years ahead in terms of getting imploded. And India is going to get imploded as well. Now, Conrad, you mentioned the fact that Brahmin caste puts this sanitized version of India. That is actually not necessarily true. The people who give a sanitized version of India are Indians who live in the Western countries, particularly who live in California. These are people with a lot of money. They have an identity crisis, and they lobby very heavily with money to create a positive image of India. Because unfortunately, they have a state tribal. They still associate their own image to that of the image that they portray of India. As a result, they have created a sanitized image. There wasn't a sanitized image 20 years back. 20 years back, when I used to visit the West, I would often be asked about snakes on the road and cows on the road, which still exist actually, except that a new version of history has been created in the modern mind because of these rootless Indians living in the US who have left India, but who haven't disengaged their identity from their own.
Okay. Could we I think now would be a good time, we should talk about resources more, because that's sort of what you do, right? You're an investor in natural resources. And I just wanted to, we had a little thing about Belt and Road earlier, so I wanted to ask you about that, because it's very important to natural resource development in the East. And also to maybe talk about China and India's natural resource sectors. But about Belt and Road, I just wanted to ask you, a lot of different takes on Belt and Road. Some people have been saying that it's a sort of ploy to get African countries into a debt trap, right? Other people have had different views. I mean, I know Yanis Varoufakis talked about how the Chinese basically went into Ethiopia and built all kinds of infrastructure for free, hoping that this would kind of get them in their good books if oil was discovered. I know Michael Hutton, the economist, or Michael Hutton, has said that it's not likely that these countries are going to fall into exceedingly severe debt problems because, a lot of the transactions that are going on are occurring directly, right? We'll build infrastructure, you give us natural resources. It's not occurring in the context of debts which are backed by foreign currencies that you're paying extensive interest rates on. So one question I want to ask you again, what do you think of Belt and Road and the impact that's going to have on other countries in the region? And I don't know that much about this. And two, what do you think the state of the natural resource sector in India versus China is?
Okay, so if you fly to Addis Ababa, and if when you travel in Africa, you often transit through Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And when you go there, not thinking where you have arrived, you might think that you have arrived at a Chinese airport. It's packed with Chinese. There are a lot of Chinese companies and Chinese people operating in Africa. The belt, China constructed a train line, I think it's in Kenya, and they failed to generate productivity from that train line to create a return on that investment. And that has happened with a lot of things to do with this Belt Road, One Belt, One Road project. Now, as I made it very clear, I'm a big fan of China. I think China has done a lot of good. Overall, it's the emerging star of the planet. It has done exceedingly well over the last 30 years, and I love that country. But I think there might have been certain kind of hubris involved in catering to this One Belt, One Road project. They have invested a lot in Africa, and then they realized that Africa could not be whipped into compliance, and they could not really generate a return on their capital. Increasingly, as you rightly mentioned, I operate in the resource sector. I visit Africa quite a bit. Chinese companies have increasingly started investing in the Western countries. They buy projects in America, in Canada, and in other American continental countries. So Chinese have learned through hardship that Africa isn't as easy as they thought it was going to be. You can't just bribe and bribe people, local authoritarians in Africa to get you business and get things moving for you. Africa is extraordinarily dysfunctional everywhere. So, One Belt, One Road project will have will result into a lot of mistakes. Some of that will be good. I mean, China has built a highway through Pakistan to connect itself with a port in the Indian Ocean, and that's probably a good thing. I don't know the numbers on that, but some of those things will turn out to be very good, some horribly. Overall, anything top down of this kind does not necessarily work. You should have bottom up. You should have a demand for infrastructure before you construct infrastructure. Now,
that's an interesting idea in terms of what creates demand for infrastructure, because it almost seems like a very abstract concept in terms of, do you think India has? I feel like India has a demand for infrastructure.
No, actually not. No. So this is what happened. I have been involved in supplying industrial equipment to India when I was working in India. So India was short of electricity those days, heavily short of electricity. You still have a huge problem with the supply of electricity. The problem is that it was believed that what you have to do is to put infrastructure in place, and India would be on its path to development. The problem is that the usage that you can put the infrastructure to cannot generate the return to provide for maintenance of that infrastructure. So that infrastructure eventually falls into pieces. People can't really afford to buy electricity in that country. So despite that, they probably have excess supply of electricity today. It cannot be supplied because people can't afford it. People can't afford it because they can't use that electricity to be productive enough to be able to pay for it. It's an economic question.
It is an economic question. It sounds like electricity cannot generate the monetary return from the Indian people because of extreme poverty. And then, I have to ask once again, isn't that a social issue? Isn't then once again you must address extreme poverty?
So you are very correct in asking that question, Eliot. What comes first? Should we get rid of poverty before you get rid of superstitions and before you install good institutions? Everywhere you have seen that there has to be an emergence of rationality and morality in a society before you can get rid of poverty. The Western society went through that. I mean, they were the first people to emerge out of the forever poverty of humanity. But they started to have, as you rightly mentioned, the Greco-Roman philosophical revolution. You had Renaissance, you had Reformation, you had the revolutions. You created a critical mass of enlightened people to lead Europe out of this animal kind of existence. Unfortunately, that has to happen first before you can make use of any institutions, any infrastructure. you can give them a lot of money, but they consume all that money. You can give them factories, the factories rot away. You give them free roads and free airports in these third world countries, and they all fall apart. Unfortunately, that's the reality in all these third world countries.
Well, what gives rationality, I wonder, and of course there's an obvious question to Conrad, which is the universal concept of rationality important to change development? But I think before something like that, in terms of what delivers this rationality, it's not necessarily philosophy, it's not necessarily culture. What delivers rationality to a people? How does rationality and reason get instilled in this kind of framework? Is it possible? Does it get instilled, or is it just present? I don't know.
Well, I think it's a very subliminal thing. It's something that, from what I understand, started in in England. It happened over a period of 2.5 millennia. It happened over a period of 2.5 millennia with the Greco-Roman philosophers and all the Christianity and 2,000 years of changes that happened in Europe. It's a culmination of many things. It's a culmination of religion, a certain kind of culture that the so-called barbarians or the people in Europe already had before Christianity came. The religion, the concept of philosophy and reason introduced by Greco-Roman people. And then the subsequent revolutions, the intellectual revolutions that happened in Europe. It was an extremely slow process, but it was many factors coming together in England to generate what I would call a capitalist morality, where you give sovereignty to the individual, which is actually, unlike to Americans and Europeans, it's a very unique concept. Sovereignty of the individual is unthought of in most of the third world countries because they're so tribal. Where I grew up, there's no real concept of sovereignty of the individual. So these things got infused into the society slowly, where a normal guy in America and England considers sovereignty of the individual to be a given. It isn't actually the natural way of existence in the third world countries.
I mean, this is kind of strange. Like, I understand what you're saying. It's sort of interesting though. First of all, when you talk about the Greeks, I mean, they were looking to the east, right? They were looking to Persia. India was considered a sort of land of tremendous grandeur, because those were more developed sort of commodity producing economies, right? And then that sort of took off in the Mediterranean Sea, right? Then you had basically philosophy emerging at the exact same time as you get money. Right, with Thales and so forth, and Miletus, which is today Turkey.
Everything is water. A great hit of philosophy of the Western world. All water.
So I don't know. Again, this isn't that. So that's coming from the East, kind of in the first place. So it's a bit questionable as regards the distinctly Western character of that. It seems like that notion is really a retrospective one, right? That maybe comes about in the 18th or 19th centuries. That there was this linear, right, notion of the West. But I want to say also, I think what we sort of see is that, if we're talking about what we call the West, that, sort of the enrichment of Europe, right, which starts in the Renaissance, right, that you have the creation of a sort of bourgeois class, right, who are very, very intellectually sophisticated, right. And I think, a particular importance in that time we can assign to certain scientific developments which really affect production, right? Like, Galileo, Newton, and you have sort of the progressive development of kind of a capitalist society. But again, when you talk about the ideal of the individual, it's like, I live in a building in Paris, and I think there are like old ladies in my building that are like, older than women. Women in France got the right to vote in 1947. So I think they're like older than that, right? So this is a very, 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 it's a very progressive question and a complex historical one. And moreover, in terms of rationality in institutions, if we're talking about social rationality, right, which if you're comparing China and India, for example, there's no way it's one thing to say, well, if there's a bunch of money, maybe some people will get rich. But if we're talking about a wide kind of social rationality, which any modern economy requires, I think you can agree, Jayant, to be competitive today, that's not really divorceable from institutions, right? As a question, it's only through those institutions that we can get there, and China has very strong institutions. I also just wanted to ask you to, do you want to maybe talk, because we haven't asked you, we only have a few minutes left. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about your business as well and what you do? Because we'd like to hear about that as well.
That would be interesting. I hear a little bit about it, but I'm also interested very much.
So I spend a lot of my time actually writing about cultural and economic issues. I do a huge amount of traveling, or at least before COVID-19, I used to do a huge amount of traveling. I don't know what it will be like going forward. I travel about 6 to 8 months a year around the world, looking at attending conferences, looking at mining projects, which take me to very isolated places. I go to smaller places, and I always end up spending a week or 2 weeks or longer time in those smaller places to get a feel for the local culture. What I do is that I advise institutional investors on investing in mining companies, and I invest my own money in mining companies, apart from investing in China, Hong Kong, and other East Asian countries. So all these things put together, I'm interested in cultures, I'm interested in politics of the world. I like to travel, and I make my living out of helping out institutional investors on investing in mining companies, and to a certain extent, investing in East Asia.
Okay, yeah, and you're not optimistic about the mining sector in India, right? You said you're quite cynical about that.
Oh, wow. I mean, India will never have a mining sector. India actually, if you look at the geology of India, India should actually have as good a mining sector as Australia has. Now, mining sector has spearheaded the growth of Australia over the last 30, 40 years. Australia hasn't seen a recession because of the resource sector it has. India, ironically, imports coal and iron ore from outside India today, despite the fact that it has probably among the largest resources of coal and iron ore in the world. That's how in dysfunctional the place is. So no, there's no hope for much of mining in India. There will be good mining companies in India. There are some good mining companies in India, but those will always isolated, successful cases. You will always be able to make money by investing in India. I actually partly help out some companies in looking at India, but those will always be isolated cases. India is a disaster when it comes to mining. India is a disaster as an economy. India will continue to be a disaster as a society.
Okay, strong words from Jayant Bhandari. And so we've kind of come to the end of our 75 minutes. I just wanted to ask, and that was a really, I hope you agree, that was a very rich discussion, I think. Does anyone have any final comments they want to make here before we?
Yeah, there's been a big list of comments. We haven't addressed them, except Conrad put up on the screen. People were short back then in the Roman era.
Did people ask questions? Is there anything you wanted to put up and maybe ask? Jayant, would you be okay to take a couple questions from the audience, maybe?
Sure, of course, absolutely.
If you have the time, I realize we're okay. Let me see.
Does anyone know if China is slowing down in Africa? I think we already addressed this, which is Jayant spoke of not being able to get a return on their investments in terms of.
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
A lot of them aren't investments. I mean, I think a lot of it's just on Jayant.
A lot of it's just done. I might actually. So, interesting thing about Africa. I go to these mining camps in Africa. The day they get their salaries is a huge party. The party runs all night, and by the next morning, they will have spent every penny they would have got as their salary. There isn't a concept of savings in Africa. The reason why they cannot produce, they can't segregate capital to invest in Africa. Africa, as a result, stays dependent on outside money for any development and any infrastructural development. They're always in debt. Chinese, quite in contrast to that, save a big chunk of their money before they start spending their money. And that's a massive difference between China and Africa. The reason why I'm actually often amused that people even bother to compare China with the rest of the third world. China has a lot of characteristics of a Western society, which the rest of the third world does not have.
Yeah, I mean, I think this, what you're describing, like this kind of impulsiveness. Have you seen that study where they give the children from rich and poor backgrounds, like they'll say we'll double the amount of M&Ms if you don't eat them? So I mean, I think it
marshmallows.
Yeah,
marshmallows. That's my psychology study. They're finally we're in my wheelhouse finally.
I think this is because it's like, a lot of people have done research on this. I mean, when you're in a state of poverty, it's like, you're constantly in this kind of fight or flight situation, and you're reacting to things in a very, very immediate kind of way, right? Trying to maximize
working class areas in England as well, like Newcastle.
North America,
in North England, it's a similar mindset, which is you have a very low cost of living is very low. People spend money quickly. People don't save money. And historically, it is a mining. That's a coal town, famous coal town. So
somebody asked Jayant, how good is the French work ethic? I mean, because obviously France, they have very high productivity. At the same time, after Dominique Strauss-Kahn, right, they have a 35-hour work week officially, right? So I just wanted to, I guess you get the contradiction they're trying to grasp at, Jayant. I just wanted.
I like the highlights here. They seem very enthusiastic. Ask Jayant, how good is the French work ethic? They say emphatically.
I mean, the way I have read history, the emergence of humanity from animals is started with England. And I know, Eliot, you probably don't like that much, but it happened with England, and it was copied and in an improved way in the United States. And it was copied in maybe Canada and Australia and other societies which were majority English societies. I think from what I understand, it was copied in a way by French and Germans as well. But when the Industrial Revolution was happening and when England was actually growing quite rapidly, it took them. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah.
It took them a couple of generations before the rest of Europeans started to realize that there was something fundamentally that has changed about England. England had become the concept of moral values, a kind of capitalistic moral values got imbued into the English society, which was very difficult for the rest of the Europeans to see and copy.
Sure.
That continues today.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's the emergence into modernity with capitalism, I would say, is somewhat different, right? Especially when you look at England, 1500s England, Thomas Cromwell, he was to Henry VIII, I believe. He was a main advisor of Henry VIII, and what he did and why he was so successful was he was able to go, from feudal society England to feudal society France, and kind of get the French culture. And French seemed to have a society that England didn't have in like 1500. And he was able to bring this kind of French feudal social relation into the English courts, English monarchist courts. And he was able to be wildly successful until they cut his head off.
Right, yeah.
But that's, that happens. That'll happen. They'll cut your head off.
In a way, coming back to our conversation, what I want to say is that I think Germans and French have found it difficult to copy the English culture, the American culture. It will be extremely difficult, and I think it will take a couple of millennia, and I literally mean it, a couple of millennia for the third world countries to be able to copy what made the Western society successful.
Mm-hmm. I think that's cynical. But hey, I've got another one for you, Jay.
Hey, that's cynical. I'm not sure that is that not be Molyneux. That's not an argument. Is it cynical? Is it inaccurate?
Can you ask Jayant if he's read Capital: The Eruption of Delhi? Someone asked. Have you read this, Jayant?
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay. You talked earlier about hyperinflation, I think, arising were America to implement public Medicare? Was that it?
Well, there's also this big discourse now with the Biden administration. What's going to happen? What's with printing money? Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you feel about this issue about hyperinflation, Biden, public Medicare in the United States? As they said, how will hyperinflation kick in?
So America provides the most stable currency even today, and that is why it's accepted around the world. China sits on trillions of dollars of American currency in treasuries, and so does Hong Kong and every other country on the planet. But that will stay only as long as American dollar has the confidence of the people of the world. If America starts printing more than it can create acceptability for its currency, inflation and hyperinflation can kick in very quickly. The problem is that over the last 3 generations, we have forgotten about hard money. Until 1970s, money, the fiat, what is now fiat currency, was backed by something real, gold or silver or something else around the world. That no longer exists. For the last 3 generations, we have come to believe that to create prosperity, all you have to do is to run the printing press. There's a guy called Ro Khanna, which is probably not very far from the region you are from, Eliot, a Californian congressman. He's asking the government to pay $2,000 to every single American for the last 1 year, every month, and going forward as well. Now, you only have to do simple calculation.
Yeah, California puts forward progressive things that don't make sense consistently, including the LA legal system. I remember our head prosecutor. I work in community clinics. I'm state-funded, neoliberal state-funded through an organization, but through the state. And they say, we're having this problem with youth crime, and our goal is to have 0 youth crime.
Right.
And everyone goes,
yeah, it's crazy stuff. Yeah, there's nothing like 0 or 100% in the world. The problem is he forgot to calculate that you have to increase taxes for every human being in America by 50. You have to take away extra 50% of his income every year to be able to pay for that $2,000 per person. So it's absolutely crazy things that are being asked for in the US today. Biden has overpromised Americans. And I think that has a very high likelihood of putting America on a path to what has been so far only restricted to Latin America, which is Latin American experiments with hyperinflation. I hope it doesn't happen, but America is not on a right path right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe Biden's words are pure rhetoric, and he won't actually help Americans. And then that would be great, and the dollar would stay or something.
Unfortunately, the radical left is in control. He is, the riots in Portland, Denver are continuing, and he has no longer control over that. So give me free stuff is becoming a very vociferous section of the society in America, and so in the Congress. So unfortunately, he has limited, they are the people who control what Biden does.
I mean, you have to be careful though about economic contraction, right? That's a serious risk, right? So, if Biden has been saying, the amount that he gave, like 1.4 trillion, it's not that much. I mean, I've read that it may produce a difference of 1% a year in economic growth. The United States has 28 trillion in debt. At the same time, he's saying, we need to at some point balance the budget. And, that could just mean like increasing unemployment by 20%, lowering wages by 20%, shrinking the economy by 10%. If we're, the thing about, obviously, I agree with you, by the way. I'm not one of these guys who thinks you can just, I'm not like a hard, I'm not so much in the hardcore extreme of like MMT. You just like print money,
or direct payments, which isn't necessarily the radical left. That's Andrew Yang guys, and I never liked Andrew Yang.
Well, and Milton Friedman, right? Milton Friedman.
And he's very popular on the left and the right. Yeah, Milton Friedman. Yeah. But I mean, you're right in terms of this idea of that direct payments are the way is a kind of very shaky idea. And in terms of what infrastructure should be built, and we've talked about the Canadian healthcare system. I think I have a disagreement in terms of what does it mean. I've experienced the American healthcare system from like a kind of middle class income place. And when you have, like, for instance, when you are like on HMO insurance, it's not great. But if you do have the money to pay for it, it's good. And I have family members who do have the money to pay for it, and they pay for their own healthcare, which is more important for them. I'm like 31, and they pay for it and they get good healthcare. So there is this disparity, and I don't think it's quite the same thing as this kind of printing money with COVID thing that's happening. How
do you if you're going to print money, right? Because I agree with you, right? I'm not one of these just print money guys. I'm a Marxist, so I believe in a capitalist economy, value, which is different than price, right, comes from labor time with some caveats. But I think the question is, how do you, if you're going to print money, how do you invest it in a way that's eligible to lead to economic returns, right?
And we are coming towards time, so let's wrap this up.
Yeah, sure.
But I think that's a good question, right, in terms of what should investments be made and how should investments be done?
Well, that is why private sector should be allowed to invest money rather than government, because socialism has a calculation problem. You cannot calculate how to generate returns in a socialist structure. Even in a very nice, compassionate socialist structure, you can't have the calculating capacity to make sensible investments. So, for example, Conrad, if I, when I go on company trips, it's much easier to be liberal with how I spend my money, because it's not my money. It's very easy for people to fall into that trap when they are politicians or bureaucrats, because it's not their money. They're not accountable for the outcome, not accountable for at least the long-term outcome. And that is why socialist system has the calculation problem. You should not be printing money. You should let the private sector take interest rate higher in the banking system and put that wealth into what generates the most output. That is the only way to put an economy on the right path.
An interesting question. And this is always a question for a socialist, right? Like, how do you calculate use value, right? When you distance yourself from the sort of these linear conceptions of exchange value, right? How do
you relate to investing things not for profit, like not for the return, necessarily, in terms of investing things for a societal benefit? And I think those are the questions that, of course, those are the eternal questions. To a certain extent.
Well, so I make money by contributing to other people. Why would they buy anything from me if I did not contribute to their life? What I supply to them does not just generate a profit for me. What I supply generates is bought by other people, because it generates an even more profit for them. And that is how social prosperity improves. So anything that I generate ethically, of course. So you have to, that's where the morality is a very important part of every equation. As long as you invest based on a certain social moral code, profit is the only indicator of whether I'm generating value or not.
Okay. Well, we could talk about the limitations of the private sector, but let's give you the last word there. I think that's best to give you the last word. Jayant Bhandari, thank you so much for coming on here. Really great, enriching discussion. I think everyone in the chat, a lot of comments, people really enjoyed it, and hopefully you'll be able to come back sometime, and we can have a round two with Eliot, myself, and you.
Yeah, the true radical centrism here.
Did you want to mention the website or anything like that, Jayant?
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Well, thanks very much, Conrad and Eliot, for having me here. I actually was on your show before you realized that I was already here. So I heard you talking about me before we started the conversation. I saw your comments on Facebook, and I'm glad that we had a very civil discussion here. Despite
well, that's what we try to bring to the left, which is we are about, we're not about personal squabbles. We're about talking about these issues and getting answers, reason, rationality. So I'm glad we've kind of shown that we can talk and we can get, when you are kind of working from that basis. So, all right, signing off. You have your YouTube channel, of course, which you can Google, and it'll show up in all your kind of talks. Do you have anything else you'd like to pitch?
No, I mean, I have a website, jayantbhandari.com, which also connects me to my Twitter, Facebook, and everything I do goes on my website.
All right. Well, great. So we're Zero Books Capital Comrades is our with a K. This was a big discussion. Should we change it? And then I said, Conrad, we just say with a K. Zero Books Capital Comrades with 2 Ks. You can look us up on Facebook. There's the Eliot Rosenstock YouTube.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. You can get me on academia.edu as well. So
yeah, and join us for the nuance, and we'll be back. So I'm going to end the broadcast here. So long, everybody, and take care.
Thank you.